Hello and welcome to this edition of The Interview. Today our guest is Antony Blinken. We are at the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Affairs Ministry. Mr. Blinken, hello. You have come for a conference of leaders for peace today. And, well, you were a Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration. Given the news, the first question I want to ask you is very simply, what do you think of the embassy move? The US embassy being moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in Israel, given also the fact that there has been a lot of protest about this.
Well, it's both horrible, what we saw on the ground, and predictable. We knew there would be this kind of reaction and response. But here's the problem. Jerusalem is Israel's capital. It always will be Israel's capital. But the subject of Jerusalem is also supposed to be part of any negotiation toward a final settlement of the Israel-Palestinian question, part of the peace process. By unilaterally declaring that Jerusalem is Israel's capital and moving our embassy there, in effect, the Trump administration took that subject out of negotiations and made a unilateral decision about it. Now, if the president had at the same time gotten something from Israel for the Palestinians, that might have been a way forward. But doing it in this way has turned what was Mission Impossible into Mission Impossible on steroids. The peace process, which was already on life support, is, if anything, dead.
But the administration, Mr. Trump himself, is saying that he's decided to move the embassy to say that indeed Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, but he is leaving some wiggle room there. He says, you know, this is not defining the boundaries of Jerusalem, and it's not the final statue of Jerusalem. What do you think of this? Do you think this is true, or do you think de facto the embassy's been moved and that is an issue that is just basically has been settled by the US in the face of everything?
It creates what we call a fact on the ground, and facts on the ground are hard to change. But again, it's not the substance of the fact that there's a decision made to recognize the fact that Jerusalem is Israel's capital. It's that doing that without trying to get something in return for the Palestinians, instead of possibly advancing the peace process, is now deep-rooted in cement. That's what's so difficult. And as we look at this, the idea of a two-state solution is more and more difficult to actually conceive and imagine. That's bad for the Palestinians. It's also bad for the Israelis, because it means, in the absence of a two-state solution, that the idea of an Israel that is both Jewish and democratic, never mind secure, is, if not gone, very hard to actually make real. Israel can't be both if it continues to have all of these Palestinians within its territory. And that's a dream that I think most people don't want to give up on. So, to the extent this makes getting to peace, getting to a two-state solution harder, not easier, it's an unfortunate move.
Now, there's been indeed a lot of news related to Israel at the moment. You know, there's also these protests in Gaza. Yeah. What do you think of the way Israel has handled those protests?
Well, look, first, there's tremendous cynicism on the part of Hamas's leadership in sending its young men and young women, calling on them to charge the fence and to try to charge into Israel, knowing full well something bad was going to happen. So there's great cynicism on that side. They're using young people in a horrible way. At the same time, one has to condemn this violence. And it's a very challenging thing, but I wish Israel could have found a way to, as it has a right to do, defend itself, defend its citizens, without this terrible loss of life and all of these injuries.
As far as the Iran deal, the JCPOA, so indeed Donald Trump has announced that he was going to walk out on that deal. Obviously this was something that Benjamin Netanyahu had been calling for ever since the deal was being brokered in the first place. We've seen tensions on the rise. We've seen rockets fall onto the Golan Heights that Israel says have been launched by Iranian militants. On the other hand, there's been a very strong response. Where is this taking us?
Well, look, I very much regret the decision that the Trump administration took to pull us out of the nuclear deal, because it puts us on a collision course, either with Iran or with our closest partners in Europe. With Iran, because if Iran restarts its nuclear program, then we're going to be faced with a choice eventually of either accepting that Iran has a nuclear weapon or doing something about it militarily, exactly where we were before the agreement was signed. And that's not a good choice to have. or it puts us on a collision course with Europe, because if the Europeans and Iran decide to try to stick with the deal, to continue economic engagement, then President Trump's been very clear that there will be economic sanctions on European companies trying to do business with Iran. Either way, we lose. So it's a very, very unfortunate decision. It also makes, I think, the region even more complicated, not less complicated, more dangerous, not less dangerous. Having removed the issue of a nuclear weapon from Iran's arsenal, it makes all of Iran's other dangerous activities a little bit less dangerous. Now, if it has the potential cover of going for a nuclear weapon again, it may act even more irresponsibly. That makes conflict even more likely.
So, just simply, the Trump administration is saying that the money that was, deblocked with this deal has been used basically to, broaden Iran's influence in the region and sponsor terrorism. What do you think of that statement? There's $100 million that were...
Look, Iran was engaged in these activities before the nuclear agreement, while it was being negotiated, and after. And unfortunately, much of this costs very little money. The money that Iran got from the nuclear agreement was actually its own money. This was money that it had gotten from the sale of its oil that was blocked in bank accounts around the world as a result of sanctions. The money was unblocked, and it came home. It's much less than the Trump administration says. The estimates of our own experts are that the overwhelming majority of that money went to Iran's economy, not to its military or to the IRGC Quds force. But the bottom line is, these activities that we have a real problem with, that Europe has a problem with, support for terrorism, destabilizing different countries, all of these activities were things Iran was doing before the agreement and continues to do after them. Nothing in the agreement prevented us, I should say, from sanctioning Iran for those activities. But the irony now is that President Trump has sanctioned Iran for the one thing it was not doing, which was pursuing a nuclear program.
You were actually involved in negotiating that deal. Hassan Rouhani is going around, the world basically. He started with China, Russia. Is there a chance that this deal might survive the US walking out, or does that not make sense?
Look, it's very difficult because, again, if President Trump is to be taken at his word, if European companies and other companies around the world try to continue economic engagement with Iran, then the United States will try to sanction them, and those companies will be forced with a choice between operating in the United States, the U.S. market, or operating in Iran. And given that choice, it's pretty likely what they will choose. Now, some countries will not go along, and particularly with regard to the sale of oil. In the past, when we had sanctions on Iran before the agreement, for the purpose of getting Iran to the negotiating table, we convinced countries around the world to limit their purchase of Iranian oil and then not to send the proceeds back to Iran. I think a number of countries, if we try to do the same thing now, won't play that game. So whatever sanctions result, whatever pressure results on Iran, will be leaky. It will be less than we had before the agreement. But for Europe, I think it's a very difficult place to be because this choice, Iran or the United States, is a pretty hard one.
Plan B, do you think there is one?
I hope so, but I'm very skeptical. I think President Trump's plan B is to try to negotiate, again, a broader deal that involves Iran's activities in the region, that involves its missile program. But why Iran would go along with such a deal, why it would have to go along with something where it gives up more and gets less, is also pretty hard to imagine. So unfortunately, I think Plan B really puts us back where we were before Plan A, which is to say, before the nuclear agreement, Iran moving very quickly toward the capacity to have a nuclear weapon and confronting us with a binary, very difficult choice between either accepting that or taking military action to do something about it.
Do you think that all this is going to result in a new front in Syria, an even more complicated landscape? Now, we know Israel has been, hitting Iranian and, militias, pro-Iranian militias in Syria for most of the war there. What do you think is going to happen now? Do you think we're going to have a proxy war between Iran and Israel?
We're already seeing that. I think we're already seeing various confrontations between Israel and Iran in Syria, to some extent with a proxy in between. Israel's been very clear that if it sees Iran supplying Hezbollah with missiles in Syria, it will act, and it has many times in the past few years. It also wants to deny Iran a durable foothold in Syria, so it's going after any attempts by Iran to establish that. That increases the prospects for conflict. At the same time, you have American forces in Syria and Iraq very close to either Iranian-backed militia or even Iranian forces. There's potential for misunderstanding and conflict there. You also have the situation in Yemen, which remains both horrific and explosive. So there are a lot of fault lines that are getting deeper and deeper.
As far as North Korea, Donald Trump is meeting with Kim Jong-un on the 12th of June. That's something which is obviously a first. What do you think might happen with that? And the other thing is, with this deal being broken with Iran, is that not going to make the North Koreans weary of a deal with the U.S.?
Well, certainly what President Trump did in pulling out of the Iran deal makes more complicated his effort to get to some kind of resolution and agreement with North Korea. Indeed, Kim Jong-un, looking at what we did with Iran, has to say to himself, why would I trust any agreement with the United States if it's going to tear it up in 2 weeks' time? That's a problem. The other problem is, by criticizing the Iran deal so violently, by saying it was weak, that it was the worst deal ever negotiated, President Trump has raised the bar for himself on anything he negotiates with North Korea. It has to be a stronger agreement. Now, that's hard to get, because will he be able, with North Korea, to get the North Koreans to dismantle almost all of their nuclear program up front, as we did with Iran? Will he be able to get North Korea to accept the most intrusive inspections regime in history, as we did with Iran? That's pretty tough. All of that said, we have to wish President Trump very well. There is an opportunity. This may be a moment where we can make some progress with North Korea. The North does need an economic lifeline. At the same time, it's so advanced, its nuclear and missile program, that it may be able to take a time out from testing. But it's worth trying this out. That said, caution, realism. We've been here before. North Korea is very good at getting into a negotiation, wringing out economic concessions, and then walking away from any commitments. Maybe this time is different. We have to hope that it is.
Well, Mr. Blinken, thank you very much. This is all we have time for. You can watch this interview and obviously all international news on France24.com. Thank you for watching.